Well, this is going to be our first slideshow that isn't just talking about how you're going to be doing things in Blackboard, but actually how we're going to approach the study of film in this course. So I'm going to just talk kind of broadly here about some of the considerations, what we think about in this class, what our general approach is to understanding film. Now, I always tell my students that although kind of one of our goals of this class is to provide you with all kinds of questions and tools and vocabulary to talk about film in ways you haven't before, it's still really valuable and valid to always start from the point of what our initial reaction is. Do we like a film? Sometimes on further reflection, we'll find out that we maybe like something more than we thought we initially did, or perhaps a film is just a lot more fun to think about and talk about than it is to actually watch. Regardless, it's totally valid just to start from this standpoint of whether you like something or not, which is of course a very natural reaction to how we're used to watching film and talking about it with others. Now, what we're going to really learn to do though is to try to understand why we have that reaction. What is it about a film that causes us to enjoy it or not? Okay, so of course we're used to thinking about those things in terms of just taste. Well, I like these kinds of things, you like those kinds of things. Maybe together we like these others, and maybe we'll never ever agree on what is a good movie or not. And taste is absolutely, again, valid and a true force, but what we ought to do is think about not only where does our taste come from, but how is it that our reaction to a film is not just about what taste we bring to the film, but the result of what happens in the film and how those things happen, how we experience the film itself. How are the events delivered to us and what happens in a movie presented to us? That is, what is our experience of a film? So, we can think about these things roughly divided up into two. What happens, that being the content, the things inside the film, the events, the plot, what takes place, and then how we experience what happens. That is the form, how the work is presented to us, how the story is structured, how we see things, how we hear things, how the story plays out, right? So we have content, what happens, and then we have our experience of that content, the form that it takes, which of course the experience is going to differ depending on who you are and what you bring to it. But for us, what we can look at is content and form to help us think through our experience. Now, the thing about movies is that, yes, they create a world, they create a kind of work of art. However, that world of the film is not completely separate from our own world. In a lot of ways, it's like our world, and yet, of course, it's unlike it. It can't exactly replicate what our world is like. It presents us a particular version, a particular glimpse about this world or another world or our own world at a different time or a different place outside of experience. And all filmmakers draw from the world in which they live. They are making a popular art. They are making art that is meant to be experienced by lots of people. Therefore, they deal with real experience, things that make meaning to us, that are meaningful to us, that we know about to some extent, right? So really, I'm just laboring over the fact here that we ought not approach film as if it is something that springs purely from the genius and imagination of some artist. Rather, those artists, whether they're writers, directors, editors, or so on, are playing with the world that we are a part of in some way. And what we see is their shaping, reimagining, recombination in order to give us a particular experience of a film and of a story. So when we see a movie, we are experiencing that world of the film, but we're also bringing our own world to it and our own experience. And one key way to think about the pleasure of film and what's so unique about it is that those things coming together allows us to play this game. what we'll call the game of what if. What if this thing happened? What if the world was like this? What if we could put a man on the moon and we could replicate that man over and over again? Oops, I'm starting to give spoilers. I better stop. I'll talk about another example. These pictures are from a film that came out, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, something like that, called Her. It was directed by Spike Jonze, and I highly recommend it if you haven't seen it. And it presents a future that is just not very far removed from our own, where essentially people date robots that basically take the form of something like Siri, but a more romantic Siri, you know, the digital assistant on your iPhone or whatever you might have, or those speakers that talk to everybody now, whatever they're called, Allegra. That's a medicine, isn't it? Alexa, there you go. In Her, it essentially plays the game of what if you had artificial intelligence that was such a good companion that you could actually fall in love with that thing, that being. How would human beings experience that? Would that constitute actual love? How would we think about that? I'm going to show you some more pictures here and talk about Her a little bit to help think through the different stages of production and the different ways that we might approach thinking about where film art comes from. Now, you've got one book for this class by Bill Nichols, and Bill Nichols is a well-known film scholar. He writes a lot about documentary, but in this case he's writing about all kinds of film, documentary, fiction film, experimental film. We're going to focus on fiction film and documentary to a lesser extent, and just a little bit of avant-garde. But Nichols talks about two key contexts, and I want you to think about these when you're watching your first film in this class. The first is the formal context. That is the specific qualities, the expressive techniques that are used in a film, the way it tells its story, the form of the story, right? So the formal context is about looking within the film and thinking about beyond this particular film, other films, ways in which movies tell stories. The way we see things, the way they're shot, the way sound is used, the way props are used, the way costumes are built. All these kinds of things are formal qualities. So any film has its own story, but by virtue of being a movie, it has this other context of all the other movies that are made or that we have seen that it's kind of borrowing from. Okay, so that's one context, the formal context. The other is the social context. This goes back to what I was talking about earlier with the idea that movies aren't a world of their own. They come from our world. They speak to us in ways that we understand. So any film, regardless whether it's dealing with actual real life events, comes from a particular time, a particular moment. It has a social context. And those social contexts are what can provide a deeper layer of meaning to the events in a film. They help provide a kind of thematic focus. What link all these things together, which are characteristic of the time and the place in which that film appears. So in the case of Her, this movie doesn't come from nowhere. It does come from a world where people are starting to have more interaction with artificial intelligence. Even since this movie came out, we've had all kinds of controversy about bots on Facebook and tricking people into thinking that they have actual friends when they're just machines that are actually making them think that they want to instant message them and talk to them, but it's just a machine that's doing it. This is not that far removed from our world, right? So in the case of Her, we can think about, well, what if this world, which we're used to having these interactions, was further developed, and there is greater depth to those interactions that we have with machines or with artificial intelligence. Now, when thinking about film art, it's key for us here at the very beginning of the course to acknowledge that film is essentially a collaborative medium, and there isn't a single artist who is the author of a film. Typically, if we think in those terms, we tend to associate the director as being the author of a film. And it's true that the director is usually, but not always, the person who is in charge of, from start to finish, kind of holding together the production of a film. However, at all different stages of production, there are creative individuals working. Okay, so the various stages of making a movie. One is pre-production. That is everything that goes into before you actually shoot film or video or digital ones and zeros. That's writing, that's planning the costumes that people are going to wear, that's deciding where you're going to shoot your film, building sets, things like that. That pre-production involves all kinds of people. Production itself, which is usually overseen by the director, if that person hasn't already been overseeing the pre-production as well, means the decisions that you make when you're shooting. How are you going to block scenes? Which perspective where are you going to point the camera, right? When are you going to make actors do things over and over again? And the actors themselves make creative decisions, of course, right? How they play the scenes. Post-production is everything that happens after you've finished your principal photography. Post-production primarily is editing of images, but also sound editing. It's also when these days a whole lot of special effects happen. So in post-production, in many films, that is really where things come together, where you edit together how you're going to experience a film. So an editor has a tremendous amount of power in creating what a film is like. Directors often work side by side with editors for that very reason. Okay, so pre-production. Like I said, we have writers, we have production designers who kind of provide a unified look to a film, from the sets to the costumes. These are some costumes from Her. The director, who I just talked about, is the one who's on set, who's kind of making things run on a day-to-day basis. And the producer can mean a whole wide variety of different things. But essentially, the producer is the one who is the connection from pre-production, production through post-production, the link to the money, and the creative forces that are involved, making sure things get done in a timely fashion. The producers have some kind of control over the director. All that relationship can have many different variations. So, key thing to remember here, as I said, is film is a collaborative art. In the case of this film that we've been looking at pictures of, Her, you can think here, if you look at the scene, here they're shooting a scene on an escalator, and there's a cameraman. That's not the director, that's the cameraman. And how the cameraman moves that camera has a great impact on how we see the film. Not to mention, again, as I said, the actors themselves and how they're performing. Also in the case of Her, kind of unique thing happened. The director Spike Jonze turned the entire film over to Steven Soderbergh, another very well-known and very successful director. He's made all the Ocean's 11 movies. There's another one coming out this summer. To edit together a version. And Steven Soderbergh edited the film and completely edited out a particular character. And so that was a tremendous change to what Spike Jonze ended up doing. He kept that change. He left that character out in his film. So pre-production, production, post-production, all tremendously important. All right, I'm wrapping up this slideshow because you need to watch a movie and you need to go talk about it amongst yourselves. But the three key things that I want to reiterate from this slideshow are the very things that I want you guys to discuss in your first film discussion. That is this idea of what if. What if what is the game that this film is allowing us to play? What if our world was like this? What if we were put in the position of a person who's in that story? Then the questions of context. What formal techniques are used to tell the story? How do we see things? How do we experience the film? And then what is the social context? How does that film and what happens in that film connect into our actual world that we live in?